Okay, hello everybody. I want to thank each one of you personally for coming back. And this is the second of the Jensen lectures that under the general title of Values, Social Theory, and the Anthropological Study of the Good. And in the last lecture, I argued that now is a good time to develop an anthropology of values focused on the different kinds of things people living in different societies care most about and work hardest to produce. Such an anthropology could provide, I suggested, a good counterweight to the prevailing dark anthropology. That's Sherry Ortner's term. And she describes dark anthropology as a kind of anthropology that tends to find, as she puts it, the same harsh realities of power, that's her phrase, wherever it looks. So in contrast to that kind of dark anthropology, I argue that an anthropology of values can help us get beyond what David Graeber in a recent interview called, quote, the taboo around trying to figure out what might be better than the current neoliberal world upon which so much anthropology is focused. If we really want to get beyond the darkness, we're going to have to look also for some light, and I think an anthropology of values could help us do that. I also argued that scholarly approaches to values across the human sciences have tended to focus either on the subjective side of values, on the ways in which values are subjective phenomenon, or on their objective qualities. But I set as my task for these lectures that of beginning to develop an anthropological approach to values that argues that they are both subjective and objective, and that they demand to be treated from both directions. That may not sound like a huge shift, but if you look at the literature on values, there's a very strong tendency for people who treat them as objective to treat them as only objective, people who treat them as subjective to treat them as only subjective. So it really would be, I think, a step forward to try to develop a theoretical approach that holds both sides of values together. So to begin to work towards such a theory, today I'm going to explore how anthropologists might study the objective side of values. I'm going to turn to Durkheim and to Dumont as my guides for doing this. I'm not going to worry about the subjective side of values today then, but just their objective side. There's a number of reasons to start with the objective side of values and not the subjective one. I'll mention another one at the very end of this lecture, but for now I just want to mention one good reason to start with the objective side of values, and that is that most people assume that their values are objective facts about the world. Most people don't assume that their evaluations of things in the world are just subjective projections of their personal views. Most people, including most people that anthropologists study, tend to treat their understanding of the value of things in the world as an objective part of the world. Philosophers call the position that values are real things in the world moral realism. Okay, that's just the philosophical name. The idea that values objectively exist in the world goes under. Moral realism is most usually opposed to one of several positions that moral philosophers classify together on the other side as what they call moral non-cognitivism. If you're not a philosopher, I'm not a philosopher, that term, if you just try to take it word for word and figure out what it means, is a little difficult. But what non-cognitivism means in moral philosophy is that statements about values are statements about people's subjective emotional responses to the world, or they're in some other way statements about how people appraise the world, but what they are not is statements about things that are actually in the world. One very famous moral non-cognitivist said that actually moral statements don't tell you anything about the world. All they tell you is whether the person talking about the world says yay or boo to something. So it's like, oh, caring, yay, killing, boo, right? But these are just people's own personal responses. They have nothing to do with anything like values that could exist in the world. The anthropologist Richard Schrader argues very strongly against these kind of non-cognitive approaches, and he does so in ethnographic terms, because Schrader says most people in the world are spontaneously, and almost all the time, moral realists. Most people in the world take their judgments about what things are good and bad in the world what things are desirable in the world and what things are not desirable, most people assume that when they talk about that, they're talking about how the world really is. Schrader said that's just the way people live. People are moral realists. Let me give you a simple example of this. I'm going to give you actually two. And I mean for you to reflect on your own ethnographic experience. I'm just going to draw from my own. I work with a group of people called the Yurapmen who live in the far western highlands of Papua New Guinea. And in the 1970s, everybody in Yurapmen converted to a form of charismatic Christianity to which everyone in the community is now very committed. I'm not going to tell you that story today, but just take that as given. Now, Yurapmen are convinced, that heaven is something to value. It's a place they want to go to and that they work hard to go to. They also assume that hell is a bad place, something that's disvalued, and a place that they don't want to go. No Yurapmen person thinks that their understanding of heaven as good, as a valuable place, and hell as bad, as some place to avoid. Nobody in Yurapmen thinks that's a personal judgment of their own or something they've made a decision about. Nobody said, well, I'm thinking about heaven, yay or boo, yay or boo. I think yay. They just assume that that's the way the world is. It includes a good heaven and a bad hell. Now, this example may appear too easy because it surely seems definitional of hell and heaven that one is bad and the other is good, that one is disvalued and the other is valued. But it's this definitional quality of the respective values of heaven and hell. That's my point. Goodness is just part of how heaven really is for the Yurapmen, and badness is just part of how hell really is. In Yurapmen, you can't talk about heaven and hell without talking about their goodness and their badness. Their respective values aren't something anyone has to add to heaven or hell by drawing on their subjective responses to them. Let me give you another example to see if I can clarify. And this one helps a little bit because you might think that heaven and hell, to use an English phrase that I hope is easily translatable, are already too value-laden as terms to be a good example of how moral realist people tend to be, or the Yurapmen are. Heaven and hell seem, these are obviously these are concepts that are loaded up with values already. Let's take a different kind of part of the Yurapmen world and see if this too has this kind of objective quality, is valued in this kind of objective way. Yurapmen, as Christians, practice confession. Again, I'm not going to talk about this ritual in any detail. But when people confess, one kind of sin they bring up sounds like this. They often bring this kind of sin up, and it puzzled me, so I spent a lot of time thinking about it. Here's an example of a kind of sin they often confess. A woman once said, look, I went to see my sister. When I got to her house, she was holding her baby, and she said, look, there's a sweet potato cooking in the fire over there. That's for you. Go take it. So I went and I got the sweet potato from the fire, and I ate it. My sister gave me the sweet potato, but I took it myself, and she didn't give it to me with her own hand. This is a sin that I committed. Now, during the period of my fieldwork in the early 90s, as I said, taking something that was given but not handed to yourself was a fairly frequent kind of sin for people to confess. It wasn't the worst kind of sin a person could commit. It wasn't fighting or adultery, but it was clear that people considered it a bad thing to do. Confessions of this kind of sin were always really puzzling to me. I had no ready intuitions to explain why taking something one is given but not handed is such a problem. Eventually, I worked out something of an explanation based on the fact that Yurapmen claim that spoken words never securely convey what the person speaking is thinking. This is a very strong Yurapmen idea about language, that language is poetic, language can move you, but language never tells you with any reliability what a person is thinking. So, having thought about it, I thought maybe that's why it's a sin to take something somebody has only verbally given you, but not given you with their hand. Because if somebody just says, go ahead and take it, do you know that they really mean that? In Yurapmen, you really don't know. So maybe that's what makes it a sin. But I was never completely satisfied with this explanation, because although the Eurotmen tell you that you can't trust what people say to tell you what they're really thinking or feeling, and although the Eurotmen tell you that to take something that you're given only verbally and not handed is a sin, they don't connect these two things. They never do. I could even when I would play it back to people, my interpretation say, well, is it a sin because, you can't really be sure that didn't interest them. That wasn't how they were thinking of it. And I think, then, it's better that we stay with what the Eurotmen make explicit and say that the badness of taking only verbally given things and the goodness of taking things that are given directly from the donor's hand are, for the Eurotmen, just facts about the world. The value of giving with your hand and the disvalue or the badness of taking when it's not given to you by hand, that's just how the world is. Nobody adds it subjectively. They're moral realists in that sense. The value of these kind of things are just part of how the world is. I would contend that the vast majority of values anthropologists encounter during fieldwork are like those that surround heaven and hell, or giving with one's hand versus only verbally in Eurotmen. They are things that the people we work with take to be straightforward features of the way the world really is. Okay? So I invite you to think about your own ethnographic experiences that way for a moment if you'd like to, but most places, I think, and Richard Schrader argues this, people just think the value of various kinds of practices, things, states of affairs are part of the way the world is. What I want to do in the rest of this lecture is show that Durkheim actually tells us how people come to live as moral realists in a world that in their view is rich in objective values. Durkheim has an argument about how people become moral realists. And then I want to go on to argue that Louis Dumont shows us how we can best incorporate the fact that people live in such value-laden worlds into our ethnographic analyses. So I'm going to talk briefly about how Durkheim tells us people become moral realists, come to see values as real things out there in the world. And then I want to turn to Dumont, who I think gives us the best insight in how to analyze a world that's full of objective values. Okay? So let me start with Durkheim. It's not often recognized that Durkheim made important claims about how values come to exist as real things in the world. I recently had a really grumpy peer reviewer tell me, Robbins says that Durkheim talks about values, but he must know this isn't true. And then he went on to, he or she went on to list lots of places where Durkheim doesn't talk about values. They seem very learned, but I was just tearing my hair out. Because if you know where to look, you can find Durkheim talking about values even in the elementary forms of the religious life, especially in the conclusion, where at least in the English translation, the word values sometimes appears, and the word ideals is used to mean roughly the same thing quite frequently. But an even better place to find these arguments is in two studies written as Durkheim was working on his religion book. One of these studies is known as The Determination of Moral Facts, and it's from 1906, and the other is called Value Judgments and Judgments of Reality, written in 1911. In English, they appear together in a book called Sociology and Philosophy. I'm not sure where they've been translated in German. But in these two essays, Durkheim talks extensively about values. And he talks about how they become objective for people. And he talks about why we should treat them as objective things in the world. What's interesting to begin with is why Durkheim would think he has to argue for this. I've just said that most people in the world are spontaneously moral realists. So why should Durkheim even feel that he has to make a case for arguing that values are out there objectively in the world? There's a story to tell that answers this question, which is a story about the rise of the modern sensibility that led many scholars in Durkheim's time, and since then up to now, as well as many people who aren't scholars, to assume that values are only subjective. There's a story to tell about how people ever came to think that values are only subjective. And I'm going to tell that story, at least briefly, in the next lecture, when I consider the subjective aspects of values. But for now, I just want to point out that people we can call moderns, don't really worry too much about what I mean by that, do not, people who are moderns often do take a non-cognitivist position and assume that values really only are subjective or only are personal, and that claims about their objective existence are in error, as I mentioned last time. They get the world wrong. Okay, Durkheim was very well aware of these kinds of arguments and the popularity of these views that values are only subjective. And it's for that reason that he develops his own position in relation to that kind of position. He says, I'm going to say that values are objective, even though I know many of you think they're only subjective. And he develops his argument in a pretty clever way in this regard, which is that he happily acknowledges that values have a subjective face. He says, yes, they absolutely have a subjective face, but he says we also have to insist that they're objects in the world. And here's how Durkheim sets up this problem of acknowledging the subjective force of values while proclaiming their objective existence. In that essay, I mentioned value judgments and judgments of reality. I really have never used PowerPoint before. I'm going to try it now. I already skipped my first slide, and I'm going to have to come back to it because there's another point I can use it, but let's see if this can work. Yes, okay. There's Durkheim in Value Judgments and Judgments of Reality. And watch how he says, look, I know values have a subjective kind of force, but what I want to tell you is they're objective. So here I'll just read out the quotation, but you've got it there too. On the one hand, all value presupposes appreciation by an individual in relation with a particular sensibility. What has value is in some way good. What is good is desired, and all desire is a psychological state. Nonetheless, the values under discussion have the objectivity of things. How can these two characteristics, which at first blush appear contradictory, be reconciled? How, in fact, can a state of feeling be independent of the subject that feels it? How can we have objective values in the world independent of the feelings of the people who live with these values? Okay. As a devoted non-PowerPoint person, I'm now going to take this away. Everybody done with it? Okay. No? Yeah, very good. Okay. Okay, to understand how Durkheim answers this question, we need to start by recognizing that for Durkheim, values are kinds of what he... This is going to look like Durkheim 101, and it is Durkheim 101, except that it has a twist. So stay with me for the minute that it sounds like 101, and then you'll get the twist. Values are for Durkheim kinds of what he calls collective representations. Okay, collective representations, Durkheim tells us, as you all know, I'm sure, are ideas about the world we know we don't make up, that come to us somehow from society. We know we don't make them up, Durkheim says, because we feel we have no choice about the shape of them. We have no choice about the understanding of them. Let's say you want to attend a lecture like this one. You have to understand that a lecture is sitting and listening to someone's talk. You don't make up this collective representation of what a lecture is. And if you did try to modify it really significantly, say by bringing your guitar and playing loudly during the lecture, other people would, as Durkheim likes to put it, sanction you or discipline you. They would tell you to stop, they'd move away from you, eventually they would call security, etc. You can't make up your understanding of what a lecture is. It's a thing in the world you live in, and you have to abide by that representation if you want to come to a lecture. But for Durkheim, and this is where the twist comes in, values are not just any kind of collective representation. They're a special kind of collective representation. Durkheim tells us values are representations of things we find, to draw a little bit on the discussion of the last lecture, but also the use of desire in that quotation. Values are collective representations that Durkheim tells us are desired and desirable. They're collective representations that we feel some kind of desire to follow or desire to be involved with, and that we also think it's good to desire in this way. We find them desirable. There are other collective representations that don't have this attraction for us, but values do. Okay? This leads to the question then of how some collective representations get to be desirable in this way. How do some collective representations become values? Durkheim's key argument along these lines foreshadows what would become his very, very famous theory of the ritual creation of religion out of the force of society in the elementary forms of the religious life. But note that he's writing these articles well before he writes that book, but you're going to find that the argument he first writes out about values later becomes an argument about religion. I'm going to assume that you know Durkheim's argument about ritual and the creation of religion, which means in a sense you're already kind of pre-adapted or prepared for his argument about how some collective representations become values. So I'm going to move a little bit quickly here. I'd be happy in questions to unpack things. But Durkheim argues, as again I think you probably are all familiar with, that when individuals come together to do rituals, they lose themselves in the spirit of what he called collective effervescence. Okay? There was a concert going on across the street from my house this weekend, and you could really, even without being able to see anything, you could hear the collective effervescence every time the song stopped and people started yelling, and anyway, it was good. So when individuals come together to do things together, rituals, they lose themselves in a spirit of collective effervescence. This effervescence, Durkheim tells us, makes people feel that they're more than themselves. They feel that they're more powerful or even more virtuous they are than when they're pursuing their own individual interests. They feel somehow connected to something bigger and better than what they feel connected to in their daily lives. That's all very familiar from Durkheim's account of the origin of religion. But a further step in Durkheim's argument about values is that collective representations that are connected with such experiences of effervescence come to feel more powerful, more attractive, even more virtuous than other representations. Collective representations that people are introduced to or experience in these kind of effervescent states become their values. Okay? We find them desirable, Durkheim says, because they're connected to these strong experiences of collective ecstasy, of collective feelings of power, of collective feelings of virtue. It should come as no surprise to you, then, that many of the most important Christian European rituals involve either extensive preaching about the goodness of heaven and the badness of hell, right? That shouldn't come as a surprise. That's where European learn about the value of these things in their world. They attend church services, very lengthy ones by European standards, at least 3 times a week, and often far, far more frequently. Okay, and these sermons are full of discussions about the goodness of heaven and the badness of hell. It's out of that kind of experience that they come to know the values of these things as objective parts of their world. It also shouldn't surprise you that in many other very frequent rituals of exchange, both everyday kinds of rituals and much more elaborate ceremonial ones, European have clear displays of gifts being given directly by hand between people. I can go back to the slide I missed. Yay, my first ever picture. Definitely giving by hand, right? This is an unusually massive exchange ritual, but you can see that people are definitely giving and taking by hand here. Durkheim's going to tell us that it's out of those kinds of experiences that European come to think of giving by hand as just good and giving in other ways as just bad, just as they come to think of heaven as good and hell as bad, okay? We come to see the values we see existing in the world because of their connections to our collective life. Crucial for our purposes is the fact that in Durkheim's account, values are things that no one, just like other collective representations, values are things that no one has a sense that they create by themselves, or even that they really choose to create or can modify. They are objective parts of the world as far as people are concerned. Just like what it means to come to a lecture is an objective part of the world all of you live in, the goodness of heaven is an objective part of the world the European live in. Now granted, these are objective parts of the world because human beings live in societies. They're not real or objective in the sense that, say, rocks are real because they would exist even if all human beings died off. But still, they're very real in terms of how people live with them. This argument that things that people collectively create can be objectively real for them in this kind of sense I've been pointing to, that they can be just as constraining on people and just as non-negotiable as other real features of the world that would exist even if no humans existed, that argument is, of course, one of the founding moves of social science, the very pithy version of it by an American sociologist, W.I. Thomas, is the things that people take to be real are real in their consequences, right? We live with them, really. It's a founding move of social science, and it's a move that Durkheim carries out perhaps more elegantly than anyone else. He famously did it with religion, but here he's doing it with values. For our purposes, the key point is that Durkheim helps us understand how people come to live in worlds that are saturated by values that for them are simply a part of the way things are. They simply are objective factors in the world. You may not like Durkheim's argument. You could just fall back on Schrader telling you that people just live in those kind of worlds. Durkheim helps us kind of tell an analytic story about how they might come to live in them. But in either case, we're left with this idea that for most people, values are objective parts of their world. I think that much of the best anthropological work on values comes out of the Durkheimian tradition and treats them as objective in the way all collective representations are objective. And this is the tradition I want to build on through an examination of the work of Dumont. I'm going to turn to Dumont now. I know that here at the Frobenius Institute, I'm carrying coals to Newcastle a little bit to use a British phrase, which I've earned the right to do over the last few years. I know that Dumont is very well known here, and some of what I say will be familiar to people, but I am trying to put him together in a way that serves the purposes of my overall argument, so I hope there's some value. There you go. In my account, not to put too fine a point on it. Dumont it was very important to Dumont that he was Mauss's student, and he stresses his connection to Mauss. But it's also very clear that he has a strong connection to the Durkheimian tradition. And he draws out two clear and crucial consequences of Durkheim's argument about values as objective, as real collective representations created through effervescent forms of ritual life. So here are the two most general things I think Dumont gives us that Durkheim didn't. First, Dumont shows us that part of what makes values unique among other kinds of collective representations is that they shape or structure the relationship between all other collective representations. Okay, Durkheim wasn't telling us that, but Dumont is going to tell us that what makes values special in the way among collective representations is that they structure the relations between them. I'm going to spend a lot of time in talking about how they do that. But secondly, Dumont tells us, and this seems obvious, but sometimes I think we don't stress it enough. Building on that first point, Dumont insists that the way values structure the relationship between collective representations is hierarchically. Collective representations that have been touched by effervescence are ranked more highly than those that have not been. Or you could, if we want to talk about this in questions, I think you could argue that all representations are touched by some of it, but ones that are touched by more of it are ranked more highly than ones that are not. When Dumont famously says there are no real simple ideas in the world, but only what he calls value ideas, he's saying that all collective representations are ranked by values. And for this reason, all collective representations are arranged in hierarchies. There's a Polish philosopher named Józef Tischner who said what I think said something that I think represents Dumont very well. He said, "Our world is a hierarchically ordered world in all respects. Human beings live in hierarchically ordered worlds. Remember that in European, giving by hand and giving verbally are ranked in relation to each other, right? No representations, even those of whether you give by hand or just say, here, I want you to have this, go get it from the fire for yourself, no representations are so minor that there isn't a more valued version and a less valued version of them." So for Dumont, to talk about objectively existing values, as Durkheim did, is always to talk about how our worlds are structured hierarchically. And values are going to structure all collective representations in relation to each other hierarchically in Dumont's scheme. I want to discuss three aspects then of the way Dumont sees hierarchy as creating structures that we can study ethnographically. This is really what I've been building toward. And these three kinds of ways Dumont sees values as structuring the relation between collective representations are encompassment, levels, both of those are well known, and something I'm going to call the relative elaboration of values. values, which I think is less well known, but I think it's there in Dumont, and in any case, I'm going to argue for it. So there you go. Oh, yeah. Told you. All right, there you go. Encompassment, ranked levels, relative elaboration of values. The thing to remember is that these are structured relationships between collective representations, and the things that's doing the structuring are values. So let me start with encompassment. Encompassment of the three kinds of hierarchical relations between representations that values produce that I just listed, encompassment is definitely the best known. And for this reason, I'm going to move through it pretty quickly here. This is a very kind of potted 101 version of encompassment, but you have to talk about it. So here it comes. To understand encompassment, we first need to know that Dumont developed this idea as a response to the structuralist claim that representations gain their meanings by the relations of opposition to one another. Dumont was definitely in key respects a structuralist, but he was reacting against how structuralists saw meaning being made. In Levi-Strauss's scheme, the simplest version of the kind of meaning-making opposition, or of how meaning was made, was by things being placed in relation of binary or distinctive opposition. I'm sure you all are familiar with this, but Levi-Strauss would tell us that our representation of hot gets its meaning by virtue of its opposition to our collective representation of cold. Our representation of man gets its meaning by its opposition to woman, rich gets its meaning by its opposition to poor, etc., etc. Dumont recognizes this kind of claim, but he says there's a problem with it, because he says in the standard structuralist scheme, the two parties to an opposition are always treated as equal. They equally participate in the meaning-making, he says, Levi-Strauss says, and so he's not very concerned about whether they're ranked in relation to each other. If you want to see one place where Levi-Strauss almost gets to Dumont, it's his article, Do Dual Organizations Exist? But go read, as they say. But anyway, okay, for Dumont, this can't be right. He's committed to the relation to all representations being ranked in relation to each other hierarchically, and this means even in the simplest representation, even in the simplest opposition, the two sides are always going to be valued differently. They're always going to be ranked vis-a-vis one another. Hot and cold will always be ranked vis-a-vis one another. Man and woman will always be ranked vis-a-vis one another. Rich and poor will always be ranked vis-a-vis one another. And any other opposition you can think of, the two sides aren't just different in meaning, they're different in value. They are different in rank. And for this reason, Durkheim argues that it is hierarchical oppositions and not binary ones that give the world its shape and that give the world its meaning. So that's how Dumont gets to what he calls hierarchical opposition. Once he's established this idea, he makes another very, very important discovery about how hierarchical oppositions operate differently than binary oppositions. Okay? And this is the discovery that it's not, in a hierarchical opposition, it's not just that the two things are different from each other, it's also that the more valued term sometimes encompasses its contrary. He has some very famous diagrams about this, so I'll just show them very quickly and then I'll go on to explain them. But a hierarchical opposition between man and woman, I'm working with the English terms here because this was actually Dumont's most famous example, but it's also my mother tongue, so forgive me. But this is what a binary opposition between man and woman would look like in the standard structuralist scheme. They're different from each other. They get their meaning by being opposed to each other, okay? And you know, the standard opposition in English is that male means a human with male reproductive organs and female means a human with female reproductive organs. But in a hierarchical opposition, it doesn't look like this. Dumont will diagram it in this way. Okay. It's interesting, so what this is representing for Dumont is that male and female aren't just distinct from one another in terms of, say, reproductive organs as their minimal distinction. We have a lot of cultural evidence that, at least in a kind of standard, average, say, American culture, English-speaking American culture, that man is more highly valued than woman. It's ranked above woman. We may regret this, it may be changing, but Dumont's going to say this is built into the culture in lots of ways. It's built in terms of the relative wages men and women receive. It's built into the biblical tradition where man is created first and woman is created from man. It's built into our tradition in all, the fact that they are ranked this way is built into our tradition in all kinds of ways. Okay, but Dumont also notes that there's another facet of how this ranked opposition between man and woman works. It's not just that man is higher than woman, it is that in some circumstances, man can come to stand for the entire domain in which man and woman exist, such that in certain contexts, you can talk about man to mean all of humanity. And when you do that, woman just becomes absorbed into man. That's what he means by encompassment, that the more highly valued term can sometimes stand both for itself and for the lesser valued term. It can help to get your mind around this if you realize that if you were trying to take Levi-Strauss's kind of picture of this opposition and figure out how to make it look hierarchical, you might have been tempted to do something like this. But that wouldn't allow you to account for the encompassment, the fact that woman can just disappear into the domain of man, and that's why we have it represented like this. There's an important facet of linguistic structures called markedness. I really shouldn't go into this too deeply, but if you start looking many oppositions work like this. In fact, hot and cold works like this. If you want to ask about the temperature of something, unless it's a very special circumstance, you ask how hot it is. If you want to ask how tall or short something is, you ask how tall it is. This kind of encompassment is actually going on all the time, where the more valued term is the unmarked term, and it can encompass the less marked term. Now, of course, there are contexts in which these two things really are opposed, and woman isn't encompassed in man. And Dumont also has ways of explaining to us when those kinds of things will happen. But to understand how that works, we've got to get to the next part of Dumont's understanding of these kinds of structures, and that's his analysis of levels. So I'm going to leave encompassment there. Encompassment works kind of well as what I kind of call a theoretical widget, a little technique people sometimes use on their data and then don't talk about values for the rest of their article or the rest of their book. So you can do that. You can say, look, here's some encompassment going on, and now I'm going to go on and talk about something else. Somebody gets what I mean. But for Dumont, that's not what it is. He's building a bigger picture, and the next step in this picture is a step toward what he calls levels. Okay. Levels are, you never know. I probably killed it off. Okay. I told you this was going to be a bumpy ride. Okay. So what does Dumont mean by levels? The first structuring principle he's got is that oppositions are always hierarchical, and hierarchical oppositions always involve the possibility of this encompassment. He then wants to go out and talk about levels. Okay. There might be some more, but don't. Yeah, okay, so okay, we'll just leave it there. Okay, thank you. Okay, so levels. I wish I could tell you that Dumont offers a clear definition of what he calls levels of an ideology, but he actually doesn't. For all of his brilliance, Dumont wasn't, and for all of the seeming precision of some of what he did, he wasn't always precise, which is just only human. But anyway, levels are one of these things he never completely defines. But in a rough and ready way, we can think of levels as like the main divisions, or what used to be called when I was being trained in American anthropology, the main domains of a culture or a society or a social formation. These are the kinds of divisions that in fact dominate the teaching curriculum in many anthropology departments, at least the ones I've taught in. So religion is a level, politics is a level, economy is a level, kinship is a level. In some social formations, there's a public sphere that's a level, a domestic sphere. The cosmos can be a level. The earthly realm can be a level. All of these things can be levels. In the next lecture, I'm going to mention Max Weber's notion of value spheres, and I think these are also good candidates for giving us a rough sense of what Dumont means by levels, and he certainly knew that work of Weber also. But Bourdieu's fields are another one. I mean, Bourdieu definitely had read his Weber too, but anyway, the idea that societies were divided into spheres or domains or divisions or etc. predates Dumont. That's not original with him. What Dumont adds to this picture of there being these kind of important divisions in a social formation is the insight that these spheres or domains or whatever they might be called, just like all other representations in an ideology, are defined by hierarchical opposition and are thus ranked in relation to each other. Dumont, I think, says that more clearly than anyone else. There's not just divisions in a society, but the divisions are ranked in relation to each other. And this is why he calls them levels, because they appear, as it were, one on top of the other, not side by side by side by side. Okay? And any given level of an ideology in his scheme gets its meaning in part by its value relative to other levels. Of course, ideologies are going to differ in the levels that they recognize. In many societies that anthropologists study, for example, one key distinction between levels is that of kinship and affinity, right? Weber had no inkling of this. Bourdieu doesn't care about it, but in ethnography you can see it's definitely there. And across societies, the relative ranking of even similar looking levels can be different, which is really important. So, for example, Dumont famously argued that in Indian society, the religious level was higher than the political level. That's not gone uncontested, I recognize that, but that's his argument, okay? By contrast, a good definition, I think, of neoliberalism in Dumont's terms is an ideology where the market is ranked as more valuable than all other levels, such that, for example, even the political level is ranked below it and can't really control it, okay? Given that levels themselves are ranked hierarchically, a key question for understanding value structures is that of how the structuring principle of hierarchical opposition and that of levels relate to each other. How do you take this very basic notion of hierarchical opposition and put it to work in relation to this notion of levels? And Dumont's answer to this question is one more of his very famous arguments. The last, I think, of the very obvious kinds of arguments, not obvious, but well-known arguments from Dumont I want to rehearse. Okay, as we discussed, in hierarchical oppositions, the more valued term can encompass the less valued one, as when man, in English, can stand for all of humanity, including its opposite, woman. But, as we also noted, man doesn't always encompass woman. Sometimes, even often, we use the man-woman opposition to distinguish man from woman rather than to encompass woman into man. Dumont's argument, and this is the key point at the moment, is that for any hierarchical opposition, the shift from simply distinguishing two things to the encompassment of one by the other happens when we shift levels. And he argues that how this will happen is structurally predictable. At a less valued level, Dumont says, a less valued term is not encompassed, and in fact can express its own value, and sometimes in a dominant way. But once you move to a more valued level, the higher valued term will come to the fore and will encompass its contrary. Consider again this man-woman opposition, which I might as well show in its Dumontian terms. Consider again the sort of standard average American English-speaking version of the man-woman opposition. In the domestic sphere, woman is rarely encompassed in man. And often, in fact, women are more valued in the domestic sphere. Almost every American family will tell you, well, you know, children really, somebody just told me this the other day. You know, she says, you know, my child, you know, loves me about 30%, this man said, but She loves her mother 70%, right? I mean, it's a very common representation that in the domestic sphere, women are more valued than men. But of course, in the public sphere, the sphere of both politics and economics, so the public sphere, which includes both the spheres of politics and economics in the kind of American model, is more highly ranked than the domestic sphere. In fact, it's the main job of the domestic sphere to produce and raise children who join the public sphere. And the greatest failure is if it produces children who don't. In American culture right now, these are these kids who move back into their parents' basements, right? So it's clear that the domestic sphere is ranked lower than the public sphere, and that it's really supposed to serve the public sphere. And in the public sphere, as the higher ranked sphere, man tends to come to the fore, and men tend to come to the fore, and can encompass women as standing for humanity in public discourse, such as in political terms when we talk about the rights of man, and in the economic sphere where men are consistently paid more than women for the same work, etc., etc. So Dumont is going to tell us that it's always going to work this way. On a lower ranked sphere, a lower ranked value is separated from the higher ranked value, is distinguished, and can even express itself in its own value. But in a higher ranked sphere, it's going to get encompassed, and it's going to disappear into the higher ranked value. One of the things that makes ideologies or cultures complex is that at different levels, this is a correlate of what I've just said, at different levels, different value ideas can appear to have different ranks. A low-ranked value can appear as more highly ranked on its own lower-ranked level, okay? But because the levels themselves are ranked, and that's the key point to remember for Dumont, because the levels are ranked themselves in relation to each other, a thorough value analysis can't mistake a lower ranked sphere for a higher one and imagine that what happens in a lower ranked sphere is more ideologically important than what happens in a higher ranked sphere. I'm stressing this point as crucial because a lot of what anthropologists interpret as intercultural diversity of values, as the idea that, well, even in one society, different people hold different value ideas, and often they engage in contest or cultural conflict over values. You must be very familiar with these kind of analyses. A lot of the time, those kind of claims come from not recognizing how the ranking of levels allows the same values to sometimes appear as quite highly ranked, but at other times to appear as lower. To be sure, sometimes there really are major cultural conflicts about values, and I'm going to take this issue up in the next lecture, but often what looks like a chaotic picture in which there's no shared sense of value hierarchies takes on a more structured appearance when analyzed fully in terms of levels. It's really important not to skip this step, or it can look like things are a lot more random than they are. Okay, so far, we've seen two ways values structure ideologies, by creating hierarchical oppositions and by ranking social levels hierarchically in terms of different values. Now I want to mention one more structuring principle by means of which Dumont says values shape ideologies. This is a third principle after hierarchical opposition and the existence of ranked levels. I think this third structuring principle is also in Dumont. It's definitely there in his practice, but it's there a little less obviously. He doesn't name it. He doesn't devote a full, clear discussion to it. So I've tried to dig it out and make it clear. I don't really care whether you think I'm showing fidelity to Dumont in this case, but I kind of think I am anyway. But he doesn't name this, but I think he shows it. And we can call this third principle what, for now, awaiting a better phrasing, I'm going to call the restricted development of lower ranked values. And their development is restricted because they only achieve expression in lower ranked contexts. So the key claim I'm trying to make is that lower ranked values can work out their implications fairly extensively on lower ranked levels, but only to the extent that they don't come into conflict with higher ranked values on those higher ranked values' own higher ranked levels. I'm going to give some examples. I know this is abstract. Here's, in fact, a quick example to give you a sense of what I mean that I think draws on a kind of data that we probably all have in our heads. Consider two key values of the Western liberal tradition. One of these values is the value of liberty. Okay, this is the value of freedom as the right to become whomever one most truly is. We all know that one, right? Yes, okay, good. The second value, also very important in the Western liberal tradition, is equality. This is the kind of complex idea that all people should at least be treated equally by the state, should have equal chances to realize their liberty, that first value, right? We can call that equality of opportunity, that everybody has the equal chances to become whomever they really are. And then that everybody, sometimes the claim that everybody should end up with equal access to resources, okay, which we can call equality of outcome. I'll flesh all of these out in a minute. If you ask political theorists, they've known for a long time, and I think most of us living in Western liberal societies kind of know this if we think about it, that actually these two values are not equal. Dumont would never expect us to find two equal values. And in fact, liberty is the more highly ranked value in market societies. Hence, this fantastic diagram. I thank Julian Summershy for making these on an emergency basis, and Yanti for teaching me how to use this. All right, look, what I'm getting at is the fact that liberty is more highly ranked than equality means that equality is only elaborated in a kind of restricted way in the most highly ranked economic level. And also on the lower but still high political level. You don't get full representations of equality on those highly ranked levels. And we can see this in the way that equality, despite all of the talk in favor of it, is never fully economically or politically realized in Western liberal societies. Axel Honneth says somewhere of the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, fraternity, equality. Equality is the one that always loses out, right? On the political and economic level, it doesn't get very highly elaborated. Okay, and all representations of equality on those levels, on those high levels of economy and politics, stop short when they come into conflict with liberty. Okay, so here's the most noticeable way you can see this happening. Equality of opportunity is very widely promoted as a political and as an economic ideal. Because if people are to have the liberty to become who they really are, they should all equally have the resources they need to pursue this value, right? Liberty demands some kind of equality of opportunity if it's going to be the highest value. But to create equality of opportunity, you would need some kind of prior equality of outcome that puts everyone at an equal starting place, like in a race that puts everybody on an equal starting line. But that's a problem because equality of outcome itself suggests that some people must accept limitations on their liberty. It assumes some kind of what in English we call leveling down, I don't know what that would be in German, of those who are ahead of others. So if you want to get everybody to the same place at the starting line, the people who are ahead, you're going to have to ask them to step back. Okay? But that infringes on their liberty, and that's unacceptable because liberty is more important than equality. Okay? Because the equality of outcome conflicts with the value of liberty in this way, equality of opportunity never really arrives in most Western liberal societies. Despite routine public pronouncements of its importance, and despite our school systems being held out to exist precisely to create this, equality of opportunity fits pretty well with liberty, and we can talk a lot about it. Equality of outcome doesn't, and even though it's logically required by our value of equality, it can't get worked out in the political and economic sphere. The value of equality, the elaboration of it is restricted in that way. And if you want to see that it's restricted, look at what happens with equality in some of the lower ranked levels. Look at what happens to equality in the domestic sphere. In the domestic sphere, people actually often strive to treat their children equally in terms of outcome. Nobody gets more cake. Nobody gets more presents at Christmas, right? Equality of outcome is a part of our notion of the value of equality, but it can't make it out of these lower ranked spheres like the domestic sphere, because once it gets into those higher spheres, it gets encompassed in liberty, and only those parts of it that fit with liberty get expressed. So that's what I mean by this restricted elaboration of lower ranked values. If you spent all your time in the household, in America at least, you could think of equality as maybe the most important value, certainly as people treat their children. But you'd have to look at that as an elaboration that's only happening on a lower ranked level, and that on higher ranked levels, the higher ranked value comes to the fore. I want to close this lecture. I know I'm going on a little. I didn't go on so long last time, so I'm making up for it this time. Sorry. I'll try to come back to the middle, but I got about 3 more minutes here, maybe 5. But I want to give you a developed ethnographic example that gives you another sense of how, particularly because encompassment is so familiar, I want to give us one more example that shows us how following the ranking of levels and this principle of restricted elaboration can help us see how values structure an ideology. So this is a really well-developed ethnographic example, so let me give it to you. I think it's fascinating. It comes from an article by Andre Etianu called Two Conceptions of Value. This is a title that does nothing to prepare you for how interesting this article is, sadly. Or maybe he did that on purpose, but who knows, because he didn't want it to be known as this. Because actually, this is an article about the Veil controversy in France, and I've read quite a lot about the Veil controversy in France. I think this is the most original thing that I've seen on it. Okay. Etianu, of course, was Dumont's, so the Veil controversy isn't in the title at all, not in the subtitle, not nothing. So I don't think people always find this article, who probably should. Etianu was Dumont's student, and he's one of the most sophisticated anthropologists of values working today. Interestingly, in this article, he doesn't talk of levels or of the restricted development of lower rank values. But he absolutely is using these analytic principles, and what I'm trying to do in my account of it here is draw them out explicitly. Okay. The basic outline of the French controversy over the veil, I'm sure, is known to everybody here, but just to put us all at the same starting line, I will mention that it began in 1989 when 3 young women living in the Parisian banlieue, what Etianu calls the marginal suburbs, because I think there are also some wealthy suburbs of Paris, but 3 young women living in the banlieue of Paris wore headscarves to school, and they were suspended. They were kicked out of school. Okay, many other cases followed these, and eventually laws were passed banning the wearing of headscarves and other ostentatious religious symbols in school. Ostentatious was meant to allow crosses, for example, but headscarves were too noticeable. Okay, it's not clear to people outside of France why the French get so exercised by the wearing of veils in particular. Paraphrasing the well-known historian Joan Wallach-Scott, Etianu says that for many outside of France, it's really impossible to figure out, quote, why perfectly intelligent people such as the French could consider a few high school girls wearing headscarves to seriously threaten the state. Excellent ethnographic puzzle to be solved, right? You all get that. Here is Etianu's answer to that question in terms of the structure of French values. Okay, he starts by noting that the French value individual freedom above everything else. Freedom is the highest value. Coming out of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, being free for the French means, among other things, not being bound by religion or by superstitious fear, right? The revolution was in part a revolution against religious domination, so being free is importantly not being bound by religious strictures or superstitious fear. In fact, a key way to realize your freedom from religious rules is by refusing to let them regulate your sexuality. Etianu offers a brief but really quite stunning reading of Molière's Don Juan in these terms. And he also notes that this connection between sexual liberty and the value of freedom is why politicians who represent and protect freedom on the political level so regularly have well-known affairs in France without damaging their political reputations, right? In the United States, it's actually a problem, and in France, it's a qualification because you're proving you know freedom. I really don't want to go, I don't want to talk about this in questions, so I don't want to go further with it, but it's interesting to me that this would damage you in the United States, but the fact that Trump has paid to have affairs is somehow seemingly making it all right in the United States because he's appreciated for his wealth. I mean, if he just had affairs out of loving more than one person, that would be a real problem. But if he anyway, you can work that out. I'm just, so this value stuff it's not just about shaking hands and giving gifts. Okay. Right, okay. Okay. All right. For Itianu then, the value of freedom, so okay, we know freedom is the highest value. One of the key ways to realize this value is by showing that you are not constrained by religious ideas, and particularly by showing that your sexuality isn't constrained by religious rules, okay? For Itianu, the value of freedom, including its expression in sexual freedom, is the highest value on the very highest level. We're talking about levels now, so I use level as a technical term, right? On the very highest level of French ideology, a level he calls mainstream social life. But I think that here in Germany, we can also call civilization, right? I think that's what he's talking about, right? Which is lodged. Okay. Yet, as Dumont would lead us to expect, civilization isn't the only level in French ideology, right? There are other levels. They're just less valued. And one of the key hierarchical distinctions in French ideology, he tells us, is between the level of civilized urban spaces, especially Paris, in which the highest values of freedom are realized, and the level represented spatially by the banlieue, these poor suburbs around Paris, which are where rural immigrants first historically migrated into the city, toward the city, first coming from rural France, then from other parts of Europe, and now mostly from the Maghreb, okay? But these banlieues have always been a lower ranked level of French social life. It's nice, it's neat that they're also spatial. There's the urban center and the periphery, but they're more than just spaces. They're these valued ideological formations, okay? Religious values, as we've already talked about, are absolutely marginalized in mainstream urban society. They're a very low value. However, Catholicism in the past and now Islam have always been allowed expression on the lower rank value level of the banlieue, right? This is a classic case of a lower ranked value being allowed to elaborate itself on a lower ranked level of the value of the ideology. So in the banlieue, it's always been fine to be religious. And given the fact that lower ranked values have been allowed expression in the banlieue, and generally still are allowed for men, the question of why the wearing of headscarves by young women caused such an uproar in civilized society remains to be answered. I mean, people often say, well, why aren't they going after the men who are religious in the banlieue? And Etienne is telling you, look, the banlieue has always been a place you could be religious. It used to be that you were being Catholic. Now you can be Muslim. It's okay for the men, but why is it such a problem for the girls or the women? And this is where it gets really interesting. I think it's interesting already, but it gets more interesting. To move toward an answer, Etienne points out that the schools in the banlieue have long had the job of preparing children who grow up in the banlieue to join urban French civilized society. That's their stated purpose. The schools are there to help them learn how to realize and become capable of realizing the key value of freedom in ways that make them suitable for urban civilized life. I should have added, Etienne is often best known outside of France as an ethnographer of Papua New Guinea, but he's been doing fieldwork in the banlieue for 25 years, so he's not just spinning all this out of Okay. During the period that includes the value controversy and the Veil controversy and runs up to now, it's just a fact of life that most immigrant boys do poorly in school and are destined to fail at the task of joining mainstream society. Young men who grew up in the banlieue tend to stay there. Often these boys are kicked out of school for behavioral reasons, or they just don't do well enough at school and they're pushed out at an early age, okay? They don't have to be suspended, they're just removed from school because they're not successful at it. Because they're going to live out their lives primarily on the lower ranked level of the banlieue, it's fine for them then not to complete school, not to become civilized, and it's fine for them to be religious. They can continue to explore lower ranked values at the lower ranked banlieue level, and hence there's been no furor over how they dress or express their religious convictions. They'll stay in the banlieue. It's always been allowed there on that level, and they're fine. But the story is different for immigrant young women. And it's different. This is sort of the key ethnographic fact here, because most of these young women do well at school. they get good marks, they develop good French accents, and they appear to be cultivating the value of freedoms to such an extent that they can move into urban, civilized societies. But as mainstream French society sees the matter, when these women take up the veil, they embrace religion and religious restrictions on their freedom, and they clearly symbolize that they accept religious restrictions, particularly in relation to their sexuality. That is, when they take up the veil, they abandon the French value of freedom in the most pointed way, even though they have been moving toward achieving it. Okay? More than this, and I think Etienne implies this, but I'm not sure he says this. More than this, I think that these young women threaten to make the forbidden move of elaborating the low-ranked value of religion and its sexual limitations on the highest-ranked urban civilizational level. They would carry this out if, on the basis of their success in school and their success in assimilating to what Etienne called mainstream society, they moved into the city with their veils in place. If they were able to get good jobs in the city, or even relatively low jobs, and begin to work in the city, but they didn't remove their veils. And it's this final move that needs to be blocked, right? It needs to be blocked because you can elaborate religion in the banlieue, but on the higher ranked level, you can't do it. Just like you can't really argue for equality of outcome on the higher ranked level in my earlier example. These young women then can't be allowed to elaborate their lower ranked value of religion on a more highly ranked level. By expelling them from school, you prevent precisely this from happening. This halts their success at assimilation, it ensures that they won't have the qualifications to move into work in the city, and it keeps them out of the higher urban level. Okay, and so for Etienne, this is why, in particular, it's young girls and their veils that have represented such an immense threat to the values of French society. Okay, in this lecture, I have 30 more seconds. I know this is long. In this lecture, I've drawn on Durkheim and Dumont to lay out a way of seeing values as a key structuring feature of the objective worlds in which people live. That's what I've been trying to do at the most general level. I mentioned at the outset that one reason to start with the objective face of values is that most people in the world treat their values as objective. This was this point. Most people are moral realists. Okay. I can now add a second reason for starting with the objective face of values and not the subjective. I think, and that second reason is that I think anthropology's greatest contribution to the study of values has been looking at their objective qualities and showing how those objective values work to arrange what Dumont would call ideologies. That's what I've been trying to show you here, that accomplishment of already existing anthropology of value. In the next lecture, I want to turn to considering the subjective face of values. And as we're going to see, this is going to mean moving beyond anthropology to find the intellectual resources that we need to move forward. But I will do that in the next lecture, which will be shorter than this one. Okay, thank you very much.